this trend that I've noticed when you look at musicals, specifically the end of Act 1. At the end of Act 1, there's usually a big number. Big, bombastic, sometimes over the top, but certainly dramatic. I mean, this is where songs like Defying Gravity come in. They come in at the very end of Act 1, and it's big, and it's dramatic, and this seems to be a trend for a lot of musicals. I mean, it seems to be so much of a trend that they actually rewrote the last song in Act 1 of You're a Good Man, Charlie Brown, the book report, to make it more dramatic and make it more bombastic. So 2 questions can be asked about this particular trend. Why does this happen? And is it entirely necessary? Now, the first question, I really can only speculate. I don't know the actual reason, but I can certainly guess. The way that I see it, people have a tendency to have short attention spans. I'm not making fun of anybody in particular, I'm just saying, as a rule, in general, people tend to have short attention spans. Now, obviously, if you spend money to watch a play, your attention span can last the entire play, or else you wouldn't spend money on it, but you get the idea. And so, the writers of musicals tend to want to keep their attention when Act 1 is over. Because it's an entire intermission before Act 2, and they want to make sure that you stay. I mean, again, you paid money, so I would hope that you would stay through intermission to Act 2, but I've also known people to leave after Act 1 for reasons that I don't fully understand. And so to keep their attention, they make Act 1 big and bombastic and dramatic, so that people say, well, that's interesting, I should come back and see what happens next. And I would say, for the most part, it's successful. I mean, people do tend to stay, and it certainly does keep your interest and make you want to keep watching. So then we get to the second one. Is it necessary? Well, with some shows, I think it can be used well. As I mentioned, Defying Gravity is a great example. I think that's a wonderful way of ending Act 1, and I would argue that in some cases, like with The Secret Garden Into the Woods, those big endings also help to keep the interest and keep people coming back. But with some musicals, it's just not necessary. One example is 1776. The ending of Act 1 of 1776 is Mama Look Sharp, which is definitely not big, definitely not dramatic, and definitely not bombastic. I would argue that it is actually the least big, the least dramatic, and the least bombastic number of the entire musical. And yet, I think it's the number that needed to end Act 1 of 1776. Because it's a song all about the losses of war, people dying because of war, and families being affected by that. So it's a very powerful piece, even if it's not overly dramatic. And I think if they tried to make it more dramatic, it would stop being good and would ruin a lot of what this particular song is all about. And I think it's nice to look at this historical musical, maybe not overly historical, but, you know, this somewhat historical musical, and have it end, Act 1 end, on this very low number. And then we go back to the aforementioned musical, You're a Good Man, Charlie Brown. As I mentioned, the book report was rewritten. The ending was extended so that it can be more big, more dramatic, more bombastic. Originally, book report ended with just Charlie Brown saying a book report on Peter Rabbit, and then it was done. Act 1 ended by Charlie Brown looking up at a tree that had one leaf still attached to it. Charlie Brown was very hopeful as he looked at this leaf still holding on to the tree, and made him realize that he could continue holding on. He walks away, the leaf falls, Act 1 ends. And that whole thing is very Charlie Brown-esque. That's something that would happen. Charlie Brown would talk about this leaf still holding onto the tree, go on this whole philosophical tirade, and then the leaf would fall down, and that would be the end of the comic strip. So really, it made sense to end the act in that way, because it is very Peanuts-esque. But instead they extended book report, and that was an extremely poor decision. Now, songs get rewritten a lot when it comes to revivals of shows, and for the most part, I don't have a problem with it, as long as it's done well. This rewrite was not done well. It's like they were looking at the joke of the song, which is that all of these people are finishing as Charlie Brown is beginning, and thinking, that's not obvious enough. We need to make it more obvious. So at the very end of the song, all of these people are singing, all of these people are going crazy, and Charlie Brown eventually says, I haven't even started yet, as if we couldn't figure that out. So instead of being very subtle about the message, they take a mallet and bop you over the head and say, this is the message, do you get it? And it's just a wholly unnecessary ending, and actually kind of insulting. Because it seems like they're rewriting the end of the song because they don't think we're gonna get it. And I like the original ending of Act 1, and making it overly bombastic, overly dramatic, overly big just made it worse, in my opinion. So I suppose the answer to that second question, is it necessary, is also open to interpretation, much like why this is a trend in the first place. In some musicals it works, in some musicals it doesn't, and I think really it just depends on one person's personal preference. But as for me, if Act 1 of a musical didn't originally end in a big, bombastic, dramatic style, don't rewrite it to make it end in that way, because it likely won't work. So, that's what I have to say on that subject, but I'm curious as to what you think, so you can let me know down in the comments. And I will see all of you sometime next week. See you then.